Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Board Oversight of Finance and the Business Model, Key Indicators and Trends for Scenario Planning and Stress Testing. I am Emily Ansnick, Assistant Director of Programs for AGB. Just a few notes about how to make this webinar as engaging as possible. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to you shortly after the session concludes. If you would like to change how you are listening to this presentation, you can choose between the mic and speakers option on your control panel that allows you to hear from your device or the phone option. Please note that all participants have been muted. If you would like to ask us a question, please enter it in the questions box on your control panel and click send. The moderator will be reviewing questions as they come in throughout the presentation, so please pose them as they occur. If we are unable to respond to your question during the presentation, we'll be sure to reach out to you afterwards via email to respond. And lastly, if you would like to hide your control panel, simply click on the orange arrow and it will be minimized to the top right of your screen. I am very pleased to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Our panelists are Carlton Brown, a practice leader of Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for AGB Consulting, Lawrence R. Ladd, a senior consultant for AGB Consulting, Melody Rose, Chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education, and our moderator, Verne Sedlacek, Vice Board Chair of Valparaiso University. Take it away.
Great, thanks a lot, Emily. Really appreciate you introducing us, and we appreciate everybody participating in today's call. As the moderator, I'm going to direct questions to our panelists, and you're going to get very intelligent answers from them, I promise you. I'd first like to start with Melody. You just came out with a book, just published. If you'd like the book, it's you can get it on the AGB website, but it really is about the business model and financial stress testing. Can I ask you, Melody, why you decided to write the book at this point, and kind of your thoughts about how things may have changed or be the same, or why now?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me this morning. I'm in the Pacific time zone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the book was really the brainchild of our experience in closing a small, private, religiously affiliated institution in the Pacific Northwest. And through that experience, of course, I learned an awful lot in partnership with my co-author, who was a consultant for me during the closure period. And we really looked at the landscape and understood that closures and mergers had become more commonplace. And given some of the demographic projections for the next decade or so, we suspected more on the horizon. And really, we hadn't seen anyone who had firsthand knowledge of a closure describe the experience, describe the lessons, and share them with the industry. And at the end of the day, for us, that was what it was all about, is wanting to share our lessons in hopes that they might be beneficial to others similarly situated.
I mean, you wrote this kind of about a year ago, kind of in the middle of the particularly bad COVID hitting higher ed time. Has your opinion changed, since you've written it, or is it, I mean, things feel better now than they did a year ago, I guess, at least at most universities, but I'm curious if your opinion has changed.
Well, certainly, and actually most of the writing happened just before the pandemic shut everything down, and so it took us a little by surprise, and we really had to contemplate what would be the additional variables that the pandemic might bring to the table. And what I would say, of course, is that while things certainly feel better at this moment, I know our 8 institutions are back in person. Our COVID rates are very low, and we've managed the situation quite well. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that all of us went into the pandemic with some pre-existing conditions. So it is not as though COVID brought on the financial distress that we are seeing in pockets across the country. That was well underway before the pandemic hit, and the pandemic, but in many ways, accelerated those challenges. Now, what I would say in hindsight that we didn't know and could not have predicted is the amount of federal relief dollars that would be coming to institutions big and small, public and private, across the country. And to some degree, those federal relief packages have really buffered the immediate impact of the financial downturn of the last 2 years. And I think one of the things we have to be looking ahead to is what happens when those federal relief dollars dry up. And how
hopefully they'll never dry up.
Well, we've been in this business a long time, Verne, and we can assume that they do. And I think with that in mind, I think we have to really be forecasting what do we need to be doing now such that when those federal relief dollars go away, we are stable and strong and sustainable.
Thank you, Melody. You outlined kind of 6 kind of boxes or headwinds that I found really interesting in your book. You know, the demographics, consumer-defined product, changing business model, value proposition, competing alternatives, and student debt. I wanted to go to Carlton and ask you, Carlton, do you see those still in existence today? And which do you think are most threatening kind of for most universities? Clearly, every university has different weights on those, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about, as trustees, how we should look at these. And as I said, some of them were kind of new to me, even though I've been in higher ed for a long time. How do you look at those, Carlton?
Well, I think probably the big screamer that points to just about everything else has to do with the affordability issue as it intersects with student debt. The revelations that we're seeing now about the depth of the student costs versus the questionability of outcomes is becoming pretty telling on how our institutions are operating. I also think that there's some institutions that, in addition to the strict business model issues, are running into some moral issues now too. For example, high loan debt with low retention rates means that we're putting people back on the streets worse off than when we found them. And depending on how those percentages lay out, that's a huge moral issue for institutions. So I think that that's the kind of focal point that points you at everything else that is amiss in the paradigm.
Larry, you agree, disagree? Other of those 6 items that you feel are heavily weighted?
Well, the sensitivity to the market changes is probably I would say the most critical, and it is one of the factors that Carlton just described. That the ability to attract and retain people greater at risk of not succeeding without strong support services and without efforts to make it affordable for them is probably the most critical factor. And this is an example of one of the issues the pandemic really brought out. It provided, the federal government provided financial relief, but it also the pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of so many students that had no support systems beneath them. And those were primarily first generation, low income, African American, Latino students. And so the equity issue was dramatized. We expected the financial issue to be severe. It turned out not to be in the short run, very short run. But the equity issue was dramatized significantly. And resolving the financial issue in the short run meant that people could, if they were doing things properly, they were able to plan for those pre-existing conditions, as Melody described them, better. It gave them a little extra time to absorb the reality that they needed to find different kinds of students. They needed to make the attendance at those institutions more affordable. They needed to move beyond simply a 4-year degree if they're primarily a 4-year institution. They needed to find services, products, programs that would generate additional cash and income for the institution. And some have, and from my experience, many still have not.
So as we sit here today, we get to kind of this intersection of finance and equity and demographics. Really, it's kind of the 3 of them, even though Melody, you and Larry outlined kind of them as separate items, what I'm hearing from Larry and Carlton is they're really kind of interrelated. The demographics being, less, more non-white high school graduates, first year, first time college attendees, along with then the equity that relates to the equity, but also the financial aspect of kind of putting these all together. So you can't kind of look at them as 6 discrete buckets. They're really all very related from what I'm hearing from the 3 of you, which I think is very insightful in terms of how trustees need to think about these challenges. So tuition issues, demographic issues, aid issues, and what you talk about, support services, which I think is really interesting as a trustee to think about. How do we ensure we've got the proper support services for those students at risk, of either having less qualified high school education, or that have, lots of other issues associated with their home life. Melody, is there, Carlton, you want to say something?
Yes, yeah, I think too, we've got to look at how all the trends mix with each other.
Right.
The increasing presence of minoritized students, low-income students is the growing sector. Along with that sector of those who have a little bit of college but no degree, those are your growing sectors.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to look at the mix of revenues that have financed our colleges. So if, for example, you're increasing your reach to the non-traditional sector, then there's certain revenue streams that go away with that, or at least get reduced. The revenue we used to get from meal plans, residence homes, gets reduced at the same time that you got all the pressures on the tuition model. So I think we got to look at all of these together. Then there's a piece of this that I think for a while the thinking was we didn't have to provide, which was all the support services if we're moving to non-traditional students. But the latest trends are they need as much of that as any other student needs if they're going to be successful. The counseling pieces, all the support pieces, in some cases, food, housing, all those things have come back to say that all students are going to need support services, even if they're not putting themselves in the revenue positions for those support services.
Mm-hmm.
So I often make the case for that it's a smart business move to appeal to those new constituencies or those underserved constituencies. It's essential because just from a pure business point of view, that market is growing and the market for well-off white students is shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're crazy to keep thinking if we keep doing things exactly the way we're doing to serve privileged white students, that somehow they will come. And you have to, this is a fundamental challenge to the business model that assumes students of privilege who don't need the support services that others do. So I think every so often somebody does a calculation of how the number of administrators has grown in colleges, and isn't that a shame? And when you actually look at who those administrators are, they're not accountants, they're not vice presidents, they are counseling center people, residence hall staff. They are those support services that are actually doing what 2 centuries ago faculty did.
Yeah, that's true.
Faculty don't do any of that stuff, and you need the support services to do it. So that's an example of a different business, just a different business model. That so much of the work we need to do to help students be successful is not actually in our image of what a classroom is.
You know, to me, yeah, thank you, Verne. I agree wholeheartedly with what my colleagues have offered today, and I would put it this way. It's been a while since the 4 of us were in college, and I think that we writ large, administrators and senior leaders in the industry, can frequently make the mistake of assuming that a college-going student looks like the students we surrounded ourselves with a few years ago when we were matriculated at colleges and universities. And what I think is so imperative for our trustees is to take a clear-eyed view of who our students actually are today, and even more importantly, who they're going to be in the next 5 to 10 year horizon, and then have really a candid conversation, not just about them, but with them about what their true needs are. I mean, I can tell you, as a college student in Santa Cruz in the 1980s, there was no child care center, there was no food pantry, I didn't have a free bus pass. And what we know now is that those are some of the top 3 barriers to the students of today and tomorrow. So I think we have to be very precise about who the students are going to be, who need our assistance, and understand that our support services may be fundamentally different than what we experienced a few years back.
I mean, Clay Christensen, you talk about it in your book, predicted, 30 to 50% of all universities will go away in some period of time, as he looked at the demographic change and the change in the user needs, the client's product needs. The model you're describing, of a enhanced services, lower tuition, by definition, you're not going to be able to charge your rack rate. Does that economic model actually work with kind of the historical full tenured, high faculty, low faculty student ratio? Can we as call them nonprofit, particularly private institutions that don't have 600 or 800 students in a class? No offense, Melody, I'm sure that's not true of your system, but others have that. Can we make the model work?
I think the model has to evolve, and you've named some of the components that must be addressed, but I would throw in a few more. If we're talking about, your 35-year-old single mom who is perhaps in need of some very accessible childcare near or on the campus, that is a cost base that we have to be clear about. But you can also imagine the traditional bells and whistles of a university or college from 30 years ago that perhaps are not attractive to her. My guess is she's not going to have a lot of time for the rock wall or the lazy river. And so I think that, we have to be thinking not just about what are we going to need to do to provide properly for the students who are coming in our direction, but what are the things that we're going to do less of? Or alternatively, that we're going to do through public-private partnership. And I think that many institutions are exploring those things, have executed on some creative examples, but I wager that the prevalence of the so-called P3 model to provide for the ancillary services that we're talking about here will really accelerate in the coming years.
Larry, you've seen hundreds of universities' finances, and you've been all around the country and the world kind of looking at this. Can you see the financial model working where you have higher level of kind of ancillary of services? We're probably not going to close down the rock wall, would be my guess, or the lazy river. But where you have this kind of bifurcated student body, where you have some that are demanding, as Melody outlined in her book, it's a consumer-driven, it's a consumer-driven issue. The consumer wants what the consumer wants. Can we make the financial model work with, as it's being outlined, with today's impediments? Let's call it, high student faculty ratios, or high faculty student ratios, tenured professors, all the compliance costs?
Well, first we have to exclude the wealthiest and most selective.
Right, they can do it. We know they can do it. Yeah.
So we're not talking about.
They're probably not listening today anyway.
That's too bad, but that's one of their issues.
Yeah, so they don't have to worry about stress.
if you look at the rest of them, we exist in a free market. Colleges and universities actually do function in a free market. It's a little bit less of a free market in the public systems, but it's still a free market. It's less just because there is so much state support, even though that state support has gradually been shrinking. So we're in a free market. Under those circumstances, the number of customers, students, that will come to that traditional model will shrink, and they will pay less. If you look at the net price that parents and students have been willing to pay the last 10 years, it has been either flat or gone down every year. For the first time in certainly our lifetimes, that's the case. Colleges used to have enough supply, enough demand, that they could consistently raise their net prices and students would come, helping to create in the last 20 years the debt problem. Now they're not willing to come. They're much more choosy. So colleges will either respond to the free market, and some of them are, respond to the free market and figure out what can I do to bring in more students who will pay some cash. And there are many that are doing that. And if they don't, they'll have to read the second half of Melody's book.
Right.
Is the half that says, here is how you have death with dignity. And that's really what the second half of the book is about.
Closure with grace.
Yes.
I love that term.
One of the things I consistently state to clients is, remember, colleges and universities have always operated in a free market. If you look at when colleges and universities were founded, each time they were responding to a specific need. The private colleges before the Civil War were responding to the needs either of a religious denomination that wanted to propagate leaders, or to a particular economic circumstance where they needed to produce certain kinds of professions. After the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution had taken over the place, and we needed people with research degrees. And so research universities either evolved out of existing private colleges or were created out of whole cloth. Right? Industrialists. The research universities after the Second World War, we were in a Cold War, we knew we had to produce more educated people. So it's always been a free market, and yet so many colleges think they are entitled to behave exactly as they have the last 50 years, and that eventually many of them will see they have to respond to that market. And that's one of the things trustees can do. If they take away their lens of, I went to school here 30 or 40 years ago, and that was when it was perfect. Why can't we go back? Many trustees feel that way. Not consciously, unconsciously, unfortunately, they will. But so they have to think, what will we do? They have to think about what is the mission of this institution. The mission is pretty narrowly defined. What holds us back is how we're now achieving the mission. The mission is very clear and is consistent and has been forever. And so they need to find ways to live out the mission in by different means than they have done in the past.
You have a comment, Carlton, on that?
Yeah, a couple of things that I think have to come into play in this conversation. As Larry is saying, we've evolved over time anyway, but I don't think that most trustees, in fact, most administrations, have a clear sense of their own history. I remember one institution that I worked with began as a Catholic women's college in the liberal arts, evolved over time to become co-ed, moved a couple of times to different locations where the stress was there, and then began to develop the professional programs and master's programs, all in response to need. What is telling is how much they get locked into a view of the past that prohibits opportunities for the future. So, for example, if your college is down the street from, say, Route 128 in Boston, and you somehow never managed to develop a relationship with the tech world because of who you claimed yourself to be, well, then you're sowing the seeds of your own disaster by failing to do what the college had always done, which is respond to new sets of needs. I also think that these situations present opportunities for doing things in some new ways. For example, for connecting themselves in more indelible ways to the communities in which they live. So you've got this category of buildings by the time you're really stressed that are no longer in use. And I have one instance where an unused building was sitting at the very front of the campus in a community that was engaged in becoming more entrepreneurial and innovative. And we had to actually help them understand you've got a building that can actually become the tech and innovation center for this community. But you're letting other people build spec buildings a block and a half away to do something you could be in charge of and make a tremendous contribution to your community. Simultaneously, as it generates revenue, you're financing students to be engaged in that activity. So I think that there are a million missed opportunities on the path to destruction.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as you think about kind of some of Melody's ratios that she outlined, which we talked earlier is not one size fits all, so I'm not trying to say it is, but I think one of the things that we fail to do is really understand the finances in a more granular way. We look at a balance sheet, we look at a P&L, and we say, okay, we're breaking even, we're cash flow positive, we're making a little money. But I think the point is to understand where you are from where you are in the spectrum of the challenges that you are facing is really to get into the financial metrics of the institution, not top line, not bottom line, but all the lines in between to understand. I mean, is your discount rate going up or down, right? I mean, to me, that's a key liability that you're creating. Or are you underpaying your faculty? Which to me is one of the outcomes of this will be for a lot of schools, there'll be faculty, desertions, either from the whole academy or from an individual college or university because they're being underpaid because we're trying to balance the budgets, right? So understanding, the detail of the financial metrics associated with those, and you brought up Carlton, you may have more assets than you think you have because you have buildings and land that are not part of the core function of the university, particularly as we have shrinkage going on. So that to me is an interesting concept, is how do you develop the dashboard, as Melody put in her book, to really be able to get the trustees to understand, really where are you financially? If you balance the budget on the back of the faculty, it probably is not a long-term solution. If you balance the budget on the back, your cash flow by not putting any money into your buildings, you're probably not long-term viable. So Melody, do you want to talk a little bit about those financial metrics you outlined? I know there's not one size fits all, but just kind of what do you think is, let's call it for a public university. And then since you're familiar with that, and you're also very familiar with private universities, so just kind of your thoughts about how as a financial analyst reporting to a board, we can think about that.
Yes, thank you for the question. And you've hit a couple of things I just want to emphasize. One is that my co-author, Dr. Larry Large, who's an economist by training, Larry and I were very keen to make it clear that there is no one size fits all dashboard. I think that there are other authors who have argued such, and we really take a very different approach. We say to trustees, you need to understand, as Carlton mentions, the history of your institution, the unique characteristics of your institution that may bode differently than an institution down the road. So really part of the driver for us in talking about a dashboard is to instigate the meaningful, rich, and sustained conversations among leadership and trustees to get to those right metrics that suit the institution. There are a couple, of course, that everybody should be monitoring, such as net tuition versus expenditures. I would also argue these days that recruiting dollars per matriculated student becomes a very telling feature of most dashboards. And we give, a goodly number of what are standard metrics that at least will get trustees talking about what is most valuable. And, the last thing I'll say on this point is we encourage both the look back, right? What have been the trends, but also the forecast, and to have a very clear-eyed view of the assumptions that go into, say, a 3 to 5 year forecast. This is where I think optimism bias sneaks in. And you will sometimes see folks saying, well, gosh, our enrollment's going to grow. Well, let's look at our catchment areas and really press hard on whether that is a reasonable expectation. And if it is, what are you going to expend in order to grow that enrollment? And again, going back to our earlier comment, what are the supports that those students will require in order to be successful in securing their degree? So those are things I would urge. One thing I did want to offer for Larry's comment about the free market. There is no better testament to the fact that we are working within a free market than to observe the number and type of new colleges that are being formed currently. And that's kind of an understood phenomenon right now. We're so focused on the stressors that we're not talking about who's popping up on the marketplace to address market demand that our pre-existing institutions are failing to do. And that's very telling, right? They're going after the growth markets that have been discussed here, and they're focused on particular degree areas or certificate areas where there's workforce demand. We could learn an awful lot by following the behavior of newly founded institutions.
Yeah, it's interesting because 15 years ago, MOOCs were going to destroy higher ed. And so I think everybody, when they didn't become the destroying factor, we kind of forgot about this competition idea of new ideas coming on. And of course, for-profits, we've seen them not feel like they're competition anymore, I guess, for the private nonprofits or for the public nonprofits for that matter. But I just saw was it University of Austin or something, this popping up in a large demographic growth area that, was like, this is interesting. So, I do think, I think you're right about keeping an eye on what's going on in the marketplace. How fast can universities actually really pivot to what we're talking about? So let's say you lay out all your metrics in your dashboard as Melody outlined, and you see, your enrollment dropping, discount rate going up, your tuition goes up, your rack rate goes up, but your net tuition goes down. How fast can universities really pivot? You've been in universities all your life, all three of you, in some fashion or another. And when we get these metrics and the board says, okay, fix it, how fast can institutions with their governance structure, large trustee boards generally in the private space, smaller boards politically appointed in the public space, and tenured professors and students, how fast can you really pivot? Carlton, you have an answer? Okay, go ahead, Melody.
Oh, no, sorry. Go ahead, Carlton.
I think the pivot issue in terms of how fast can you pivot has everything to do with what kind of conversation you're having about pivoting. When most boards and administrations talk about pivoting, they're really talking about small adjustments and those small adjustments don't solve the endemic long-range problems that you're facing. So the pivot has to do with, I think, first having a deep conversation with all your stakeholder groups about where you really are. And one of the things I keep finding is that stressed institutions tend to hide the baloney every once in a while, and people get surprised. So one institution thought it was going along really well, although it knew it had a couple of problems, declining enrollment, etc. Did not know until there was a presidential change that they'd been working in the red for 3 years. And so then the new president comes in and sees the red ink and, oh my God, what's going on? And of course, the disbelief. So the first thing that happened to him was a vote of no confidence in the faculty for failing to understand what it was. Okay. So I think that part of the thing is, what are the conversations we're really having? What are we really talking about? How much do the stakeholders really grasp where we are? And how much time does a team really spend both educating the board and the faculty and the student body about what the issues are, what the trends are, what our real opportunities look like? If you don't do all of that, then as Melody has found out, that as all of us have found out at different points, you've got some strange opposition to what you're trying to do because they don't grasp what is going on. So I think the big issue is educating stakeholders.
So Melody outlines that, calls the CEO the chief education officer. Mm-hmm. So that's really up to the president to do that.
I think it's imperative, and for all the reasons Carlton just mentioned, we have a unique and urgent need right now for chancellors and presidents to deeply educate trustees, faculty, donors, all stakeholder groups, because change management is just hard. Let's face it, it's hard. And change is hard for humans. We know that to be true. And, you asked how quickly can we move? I would say on the trustee side of the equation, you can move quickly if you have a unified board who supports the vision of the chief executive, chancellor, or president. And until you have that, moving with transformative thinking is going to be rough. Mm-hmm. And on the faculty side, here we tell the story in the book where, I arrived at Marylhurst University, 120-year-old institution that was just getting a faculty governance system off the ground. So we were trying to build our shared governance, or build the plane as we were flying. And that is much less than optimal for success. And so I think your ability to pivot hangs in the balance of how well worn is the shared governance model. Does it mean the same thing to everyone? Are the terms shared? And I would have to say here, we do have to give faculty an awful lot of credit. In the last 2 years, we have seen that faculty can and have moved with dispatch. And so we know that it's possible. It's just made a whole heck of a lot easier if you have a well-worn, shared understanding of roles and responsibilities.
Well, and as you point out, Melody, understanding where things are. I think you're probably right that there's not a lot of necessarily sharing faculty the financial aspects and that kind of thing because it's not within their purview, right? But ultimately it impacts them. Mm-hmm. Larry, do you have a comment?
The first thing you need to do in any change management situation is create a sense of urgency. And so if a president is not creating that sense of urgency by providing financial information, by describing the demographics, by describing the conditions that the institution is facing now, and describing choices that people have will need to make, it will not happen. So I use that word urgency as a most critical factor, and the board has to be there as well behind the president. You sometimes see presidents who create a sense of urgency and then the board does not feel quite same sense, and they move on to some other institution to do that. So that is just a critical factor. It is what Carlton said. The president sets the tone and moves the place. The president is such a critical factor in when you have shared governance. The president is the only one with a clear, distinctive voice often.
Well, in your book, you say sound governance a prerequisite to a healthy institution, which I think, sound governance is as trustees, it really puts the onus on trustees to make sure that you're all aligned, right, with the president and with the with the administration, because it's not going to happen if you're not aligned. That's what you're saying. And
well, and I would say there is a real responsibility for the president and senior staff to serve trustees well by bringing forward the information they need to be responsible fiduciaries and thoughtful stewards of the institution's future. And, oftentimes I've heard those stories, seen it before, where a board is caught by surprise about the financial condition of the institution. And there's responsibility all around, right? Because really refined, loyal staff will be bringing forward the information out of loyalty to the institution and fealty to the trustees. And I would say too, that imperative, the relationship between CEO and board chair is absolutely critical, because that's kind of where the magic happens and where you can make sure you're getting all stakeholders together.
so as a kind of a template for this, which is clearly, I think as you talk about pivoting, changes, urgency, etc. I think you said in your book it's unlikely that incrementalism was going to solve your problems. Carlton, hit on that a few minutes ago, but and hope is not a plan. I love that. I've heard it many times, but I keep forgetting it, because I always hope. So creating, if you start at the board chair or the CEO, the alignment between the two and understanding what metrics the board should see in a clear and concise fashion, even if you have to educate the board on what it means, right? I think that's, kind of as you lay it out, that's the key starting point. And then that same information, potentially going to the faculty or the faculty senate or the kind of faculty governance system. So everybody's looking at the same numbers. Is that kind of what you would advocate to create the sense of urgency?
Certainly, one tool that I used when I arrived at my distressed institution was I set up meetings with my students and with my faculty the same week as every single board meeting, so that all critical stakeholders were getting the same information at roughly the same time, to, of course, create that accountability and transparency and be the chief education officer across stakeholder groups. And I think that was helpful.
What about faculty senate leadership attending board meetings? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of us operate in the public, where everyone.
Well, you don't have a choice. Yeah.
So I've done it.
I could come to your board meetings if I wanted, right?
Yes, you're welcome anytime, Verne. So some of us working in public systems, of course, our board meetings are broadcast. And so the whole world can participate in them. And then I've been on the other side of that fence too, with a private institution with closed board meetings. And I really prefer the transparent nature of my current environment, because again, you have the opportunity to educate much more broadly.
Larry,
get back to the question about metrics just for a minute?
Yeah, I'd love for you to.
When I work with boards and administrations on metrics, I ask them to think about them on two dimensions. One is metrics around strategy, and the second is metrics around risk, strategy and risk. So that that's a way to focus your metrics and not have a lot of metrics where you're not sure why you have it, other than it's a good thing to know the endowment.
We always had it, yeah.
Yes. So if you think about what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the metrics that might come closest to measuring what we are trying to accomplish, and then what are the risks, and this is where all those negative things come in. What is our cash? What is our liquidity situation? What is our just a series of measures like that. The bad thing, the risk is a measure of bad things that could happen, and the strategy is a measure of where we want to go. And it helps boards think through what are the most important ones, and it helps limit distracting metrics. And it's easy to have metrics that, there's that phrase, what gets measured gets managed. A distracting metric would be the discount rate. It's something everybody can understand. It's always in the newspaper. I can't imagine how many board meetings I've gone to where that's been described as a core problem, where it's actually not. What's a issue is what's your net tuition from each student. Doesn't matter what your discount rate is, because the price is an artificial number. The sticker price is a totally artificial number, and when you can manipulate one or the other, it creates unintended consequences or unintended effects. And there are a number of those that may be important to one institution but not important to another. That's why if you think strategy and risk, you're more likely to get there. And you want to do it going back at least 5 years. Sometimes you can do it more for your own institution, because in those cases, you're actually measuring the numerator and the denominator in the same way over time. When you try to compare to other institutions that are measuring the numerator and the denominator in different ways, again, it leads to distraction and sometimes poor decisions, unless you're actually making those ratios off their audited financial statement, which actually has some consistent measurement with it. But anyway, thinking strategy and thinking risk is a useful way to narrow the number of metrics to ones that matter the most.
I mean, and I think in my mind, I've always done stress testing going back to, looking at the investment portfolios back in the olden days, thinking about what would happen if, Russia defaults on their debt, or, kind of in a university environment, the stress testing is somewhat different, and particularly is, you can get content. I think about international students and how, many institutions rode the international student wave, having 10 or 15%, maybe up to 15% of the class of international students. I mean, that's a risk, right? Because international students, as we see, with a stroke of a pen, could go away. Kind of looking at concentrations as well as when you stress test. So you can look at, well, what if enrollment drops? What if our mix changes, graduates, undergraduates, etc. To me, it's like looking at, the concentration risks that exist. And on some level, what happens is you kind of got to get back to what I would call the core business model, right? And kind of take out some of this extraordinary one-time, short-term kinds of things that you've used to balance the budget, kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think of stress testing and scenario planning, two of the titles in our little session here.
Right, yes.
As a way, if you think of the analogy of your body, it's exercise. You're testing out, you're seeing if maybe I can run 10 miles now, 1 mile now, and then 3 miles. You kind of get more accustomed to thinking in different ways than you might otherwise think. And so stress testing, for instance, does teach the need to diversify your revenues
Right.
to the extent possible. It teaches to have as many variable costs as you can as opposed to fixed costs. It teaches a certain set of lessons that only get learned, because they're academic otherwise, if you pardon the expression. They're just theoretical. But the stress test creates what would we do if, and you can have some imaginations that make you feel good too. You can say, what if enrollment went up in this program or that program? What if this happened or that happened? But it gives you the option, it gives you practice in thinking about different ways to structure the institution. And scenario planning is very similar in that you start by imagining all these future things. You start by structuring a mission, and then you say, what would be the institution that we would have around that? And what were the different ways we might get there from where we are now? You can imagine certain scenarios. But because the world is changing faster than it had before, but institutions are incredibly conservative. Our institutions, this is why our colleges let Southern New Hampshire University eat their lunch.
Yes.
Let Western Governors University eat their lunch. MOOCs did not die. MOOCs have conquered hundreds of thousands of students who otherwise would have gone to existing institutions. They have eaten our lunch because we haven't developed the flexibility, the stamina in terms of our governance and our finances to be more responsive to the changing environment.
We get conservative because we go through a crisis and then we revert to stasis, and we lock in at that next reality on the unspoken assumption that the next crisis is not coming. So one of the ways to use scenario planning is an ongoing perpetual dialogue among all stakeholder groups that does not feed directly into strategic planning, but creates the mindset for continuing to think about where we are and what's happening to us and what's happening around us. And that way, when you get down to particularly pivot making strategic plans, you've got a community that is actually set to move forward in that. And I think institutions that do that are institutions that share information broadly. They're constantly in dialogue about it. And as I've had to do at least one institution, actually teach people how to think with the leadership. So when I get to this institution, anytime I said anything, the assumption of the community, oh, that's what we're going to do. So I had to teach, look, I'm going to throw things out there, and I'm throwing them out there because I want us to think about them. And it took about 2 years to get people accustomed to that. They've been trained to the idea that you pay attention to what the president says because that's what you're going to do next. Absolutely. Even if it's phrased as a question. So I think changing our whole method of governance and interaction inside the institution is a great way of utilizing what Larry's talking about.
Let me ask a really important question associated with this. How do you do it? Who does it? We kind of know the metrics. We kind of outlined how you do the metrics. Who actually thinks of the scenarios? Who actually runs the financial numbers? Because I think that's most institutions don't have, I'm sure you do, Melody, but have a lot of staff people just sitting around, financial people, just sitting around waiting for you to ask scenario questions. Because really everybody does. But how do you actually go about executing a scenario or a stress test in a way that is more than just sitting around talking about it?
Well, at my institutions, every place I've ever been, it has been the finance department that has been really instrumental in being a thought partner to me. And I will say I've been extraordinarily fortunate to have had a series of CFOs who are not just great number crunchers, but who are also thought leaders and who stay up on the trends and the challenges within our industry, and frankly have all been phenomenal communicators. And those skill sets don't all necessarily always reside in the same person. But I've been incredibly fortunate to have CFOs who are really transformative thinkers and who can communicate very complex information to lay audiences, which is key here. Because our budgets, ours is a multi-billion-dollar budget. It is complex. The sources of revenue are many. And so I think we have a real burden in terms of the communications skills of our finance teams. So it may be me and academic officers, maybe some very well steeped trustees who will say, well, what about this innovation? What about that innovation? But to map out the hard numbers, I have been very fortunate to rely on very skilled CFOs.
Thank you. I want to finish up with, sorry, cut you off, Carlton or Larry. I want to finish up with one question. We've got 4 minutes left, so we each get 1 minute. The question is, like, I like to finish up these kinds of things with is, give me something that you see happening in the next 10 years to higher education that's outside kind of the normal distribution. Tell me, I don't know what it is, but I'm just curious as you think outside the box, something that we can't necessarily predict today, but you will be the first one to predict it. I'm going to start with you, Carlton.
I was afraid you were going to do that.
Thank goodness.
I think it is going to be the unboxing of academic programs, in the sense that we unbox them and we connect them to more things external to the university than we have before, and we begin to more fully integrate world of work with academics, with student development, with the evolution of the enterprise, and that we put ourselves in a position for constant change in that regard. And I think we do that because the more we get to know who our students are and will be, the more we're going to realize that we cannot disconnect these things, and our traditional model has everything disconnected.
Larry, you're next.
Well, similar to Carlton, I think the word competency education, or phrase competency education, is a good summary of what that's likely to be. The less reliance on degrees, more reliance on certificates, on other kinds of competency-based activity. Degrees are a convenience of the industrial age. And we are past the industrial age, but this is hanging in there. And that will be a significant change.
Thank you, Larry. That's great. Melody, we started with you. We're going to finish with you. So you get the last word.
All right.
Other than me, of course.
There we go. Well, I already mentioned it, but I think it is possible we could have a wave of college openings. And that is not something that was on my radar when my co-author and I wrote the book, far from it. But as we've already mentioned today, we do operate in a free market. And if our institutions of longstanding remain resistant to change and innovation and continue to be risk averse, I think that we will see significant philanthropy move in the direction of starting new institutions that don't have to go through the pain of change management, right? They can innovate from scratch. And I think that could be very interesting. It might also be the catalyst for institutions of long standing to finally make the changes that we need to make.
Great, thank you. All three of Carlton, Melody, Larry, been terrific. Extraordinarily insightful. I learned a lot, and so I appreciate you very much participating and being the panel for today's webinar. With that, I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Yeah, thank you. Well done, panelists. This was wonderful. And I know we did get some questions, and we will follow up with you directly afterwards. So thank you for that. Wanted to let you know where you can find the publication that we've been talking about this whole time. So that's available on our website, and in the follow-up email, we'll also have a direct link for you. And a reminder, as you saw in the chat, we do have, if you use the code SCUP25, you can receive a discount on the printed copy. That's good for SCUP and AGB members, so that's on top of your AGB membership discounted price. And so that's for the actual printed copy. Our AGB members can also download an e-version as well when they log in. So also, this is part 1. Please join us for part 2 of the webinar series, Graceful Business Model Transitions, Planning and Executing a College or Campus Closure. So that'll be on January 13th. So a great way to start the new year, I think, maybe. Interesting topic, no less. Yeah, Happy New Year. We also have a few other webinars as we close out the calendar year, and you can see those as well. And we'll include this in our follow-up email as well. So thank you all so much for being here and participating in today's webinar. We hope you found the information shared valuable. All attendees will receive an email from AGB within 48 hours of a recording of this webinar along with the slide deck. We ask that you complete the brief survey that'll appear when the webinar ends to share your thoughts and feedback on what you heard today. Thank you all again. Stay safe, be healthy, and happy holidays as we're coming up on it. So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.